Intro. Anyway, in today's video, we're going to be reviewing all of the new items added in the Christmas 2020 event. A couple things to mention before I get into the actual reviews. First of all, we're not going to be talking about any of the old returning items or any of the limited rebirth items that were added. Since all of them are just weaker counterparts to the regular rebirth items, I don't think they're really worth talking about because they're all just worse and not worth using. And also, the reason this video is out after the Christmas update is because I wanted to let all of the gifts open so I could review all of the items in one video, and it turns out that was a waste of time. Because the question mark gift still hasn't opened up, and the Gift of Research, Gift of Life, and Gift of Clovers all open up into consumables. I do think they're still worth mentioning because these could be potentially very, very useful during Third Sacrifice, but they're not really items, so I can't really dedicate full reviews to them. And the Gift of Question Marks hasn't given me anything to review, so whenever it opens, I'll leave a comment leaving my review, but unfortunately I can't have it in the video, so that's why it's not in here right now. Regardless though, I do still want to get a video out reviewing all of the items, so here it is. We can go ahead and start with the collectible, starting off with the Advent Calendar items, leading with the Big Candy Cane. It's a 2-long, 2x upgrader, and this thing can actually be pretty handy in a couple of different situations. Of course, if you're a newer player, then it's going to be good just because it's a multiplier, and it's also a pretty small upgrader, and if you have extra space in your setup or you just need to fill space somewhere, this thing can be pretty good for that. It's just a nice 2-long upgrader, nice and compact, and useful in certain situations. Next up, we've got the Bag of Stars, which is an item that is going to be useless for a majority of the players past the very early game. This thing is a cell furnace with a random multiplier ranging from the thousands to the millions. Of course, if you're in the later stages of the game, you're going to have a lot of alternatives for cell furnaces, and this thing really doesn't have much of a place for you, but if you're in the early game, having that boosted multiplier can be really, really powerful. But of course, if you're past that, this thing is just garbage and not really worth thinking about. Next up, we've got the final new Advent Calendar item, which is the Present Refiner. This thing is a 3-long, 4 multiplier item, and it has a 1 in 3 chance of giving your ores sparkles. It's certainly not the worst upgrader, and it has a similar advantage to the Big Candy Cane in that it's a relatively small upgrader with a decent multiplier, but this thing is a little bit less small, slightly less versatile. That being said, it's still not terrible. If you're in the early game, it's going to be really useful, and if you need sparkles and don't have an Angel's Blessing or anything else that gives sparkles, it can be pretty good for that as well. Outside of that, I doubt you're going to see this thing in the late game very much, but it's still not terrible. Finally, from the collectibles, we've got the Aromatic Holidays, which is a pretty simple upgrader, 3-long, 3x. Once again, decent if you're in the early game because it just gives you extra multiplier. It's relatively small, so you can fit it into certain spaces, but it's not going to be that great in the late game, and it's a little bit worse than the Present Refiner as well, so this thing I really wouldn't recommend using in most cases unless you just need extra multiplier. Moving on, we've got the 2 relic tier items of the event, starting off with the Mighty Sugar Cookie. This item is a 5-long, 8.5x multiplier upgrader, which is actually pretty solid. It's not a great NPU, and in the later game, this thing is going to be pretty useless to you, but if you're in the early to mid game, an 8.5x multiplier upgrader, especially one with this size, is actually really good. So for me, this thing is going to be pretty useless, but if you manage to get lucky and snag this thing in the early game, then this will be one of your best upgraders for a while, I imagine. Next up, we've got the other relic item, the Legendary Peppermint, which is actually a really solid item as well. This is a 3-long upgrader, and it can do a multiplier from 6 to 10 times, which is actually really, really good, and at its best multiplier, it competes with some of the highest NPU items in the game. To put that into perspective, this thing at its best is on par with the Meatball Sandwich, which is a very good NPU item and used in almost every meta setup that you'll see. Of course, it does have 2 significant downsides, the first one being a random multiplier, and the other being the fact that it destroys ores which are on fire, which is pretty significant. That means if you do want to use this thing in a late game setup, you have to plan around that, and you also have to have a reason to use this over some of the other more consistent NPU items. That being said, in the early game, this thing is still going to be pretty useful to you, and even in the late game, if you're doing something like a 3 Tesla setup like me, this thing can be pretty useful as long as you take special care to have your ores not on fire. I have it in my setup, and it actually works pretty nicely, and it's a solid upgrader that might actually see meta use, and is pretty good in the early and mid game. So no complaints for that one. It's a solid upgrader, yep. Ignoring my inability to speak, moving on, we've got the Grand Fruitcake, which is the first of 2 box exotics added in this update. This is a 7-long upgrader with the 6x multiplier, which isn't very good, so outside of the early game, you're probably not going to be seeing much use of this thing, except for the fact that it also is a centering conveyor. This fact isn't apparent just from the look of the item, but it actually does center your ores, which can be pretty helpful. Having a rebirth-proof centering conveyor can be pretty solid in the early and mid game. Obviously, by the point you get railgun cannons, that means absolutely nothing, and this item will be pretty terrible by that point, but ignoring that, in the early and mid game, having a rebirth-proof centering conveyor that also does a decent multiplier, I'd say that's a pretty solid upgrader. Next up, we've got the Gingerbreadian Mine, which is a manually activated mine with an ore value of $1 million. This, like many of the other items in the update, is pretty solid in the early and mid-game, but once you get to the point where you have mines that are better, this thing just becomes completely useless instantly. Very much a case of you either get very good use out of it, or it means literally nothing to you. It's also worth noting that it isn't cell compatible, so it's not possible to super easily cheese with this thing in the early game, so I'd say it's a not great item. Moving on to the final 4 items, we've got the brand new exotic gift items that were added, which opened up into the Gingerbread Boat, the Ice Fortress, the Santa's Nice List, and the Abominable Screaming Tree. First of all, we'll take a look at the most simple of these items, which is the Gingerbread Boat. Gingerbread Boat is a 3-long way up high upgrader, which has a 5x multiplier. Now, a 3-long upgrader actually isn't terrible for the size, but it's a way up high and it has a pretty low multiplier, so once again, this thing outside of the early mid-game is not going to see any use. It can be decent if you really need multiplier, but it being a way up high kind of limits what it can do already, and the fact that it's such a low multiplier means that it's pretty weak. Moving on, we've got the Ice Fortress, which is a pretty sizable upgrader. It's 7 long, has a 4.5x multiplier, and it'll make your ores frozen, and this thing is pretty bad for its size. I don't really see much of a use of this thing. If you're really desperate for the frozen effect and you don't have any other item that can give it, then I guess this thing fills that role, but there are other items that can do that pretty easily, so outside of the early game and I guess the mid game, once again, this thing is really pretty useless, so I'm gonna have to not recommend this one to you. Especially for the amount of grinding you would have needed to do to get it, because the Gift of Strongholds is one of the rarer exotic gifts of the pool. Same thing with the Gingerbread gift, actually. Both of these are pretty rare and definitely not worth the grind that you had to do to get them. Our next item comes from the Gift with a Pleasant Presence, and this one is a little bit more common, and I think it's a little bit better of an item as well. We've got the Santa's Nice List. This upgrade is a 5 long, and it has a chance of doing a 4.5 to 5x multiplier, and it has a couple of other special effects to it. It has a chance of giving your ores sparkles, changing the ore volume, and it has a chance of actually giving your ores a shield, which is actually pretty potentially good. That being said, of course, this thing, once again, is not going to see any meta use, I'm sure, but in the early and mid game, this thing is a little bit better of an upgrader, I think. A couple of the special effects make it a little bit more interesting, and it's got a slightly better multiplier for its size, so this thing is not terrible, and it's a little bit more common. Still not great, but certainly better than some of the other exotics. Moving on to our final exotic, which comes from the rarest gift, which isn't the question mark gift, the Mountainous Present of Screams, which opens into the Abominable Screaming Tree. This item has a pretty funky conveyor, and it's also pretty sizable, coming in at 7 units long, and it has some pretty weird effects with its multiplier. First of all, it has different multipliers based on if it's day or night. During the daytime, it has a 5x base multiplier, and during the night, it has a 5.5 to 9x multiplier. It also multiplies based off of how blue your ores are, and it's a bit of a weird effect, but I don't think it really matters because this thing is not very good. Of course, it's a little bit better multiplier-wise than some of the other items, and if you have a really blue ore, then I'm sure you could get a pretty juicy multiplier out of this thing. That being said, once again, you're not really going to see it in the meta. I only see this thing being good in the early and mid game. That being said, it's not terrible, and it is better than some of the other exotics we've seen, but it's not better than some of the other relic tier items and such that we've looked at, and also, it's the rarest item from the present pool that's not the question mark gift. Was it worth the grind? Probably, definitely not, I'd say, especially being in my position where I'm using just meta stuff. This thing is pretty terrible for me. Of course, you're probably not going to be too pleased with it either if you're in the earlier game. It'll still be a little bit better for you though, so hopefully you get some more use out of it than I can. That being said though, those are all of the new items added. Like I said, if the question mark gift opens up anytime soon, I'll leave my little review in the comments, so if you want to see what that item does or if it's worth using at all, then go check down there. See if I have a pinned comment giving the review on it. Anyway, I think that's everything though. I'm gonna go ahead and let you guys go. Not before shouting out my channel members, of course. All of the wonderful simps of the community. We've got Crowbars, Dissa, Luke, Aeromix, Phantomace, MLG Ben, Ninja, Abyss, Gage, Alex, Bem, Vajutsu, Skella Games, Andrew, Atrax, Plute, and Totally Mysterious. Thank you guys very much for supporting the channel. Thank you guys for watching the video and for sticking around to the end. If you enjoyed it, remember to leave a like. If you want to see more like it, remember to subscribe. Yeah, look at that. The old intro going to the outro now. Anyway, yeah, I'll let you guys go. Love you, hate you. Peace, everyone.